Welcome! In today's hand, I am once again playing in the $600 bind, 200k guaranteed at the win. This is a still flight A of a 2-flight tournament, and while it is only a 200k guaranteed, this flight ended up getting 500 entries. Once again, this is a massive field. My table draw in this ended up being really good. I only ended up really playing against Joe McKeon and Ryan Lang, and then Ryan Lang ended up busting after getting very unlucky. And the player who replaced Ryan is a very young, very aggressive reg that I've played with before. I've seen him make some very absurd decisions. He definitely likes to go for it, and that is incredibly important when we are discussing this hand. So in this hand, I open pocket queens in mid position 1. It folds to this young aggressive reg's big blind, and he defends. So we're going to look at first my opening range, then his defense range, and then we will analyze his flop. So we're playing about 30 big blinds deep effective. I opened on about 35. We're going to say that I opened off a 40 effective, essentially. I opened from MP1, so about 21% of hands. This is a pretty good ballpark. It's what my actual opening range is probably going to be here. Probably going to loosen this a little bit and probably do more like 23 or 24%, but I'll be within this ballpark. And when folds to his big blind, he defends. He's playing 30 big blinds deep effective, and he has big blind versus an MP1 open. As we can see here, he is largely calling, doesn't have very many 3-bet bluffs, and the main 3-bet bluffs that he does have are some offsuit King X, Ace 9 off and Ace Deuce off is the main offsuit aces, and then 7s plus he just gets a 3-bet strong linearly there, mixing in some shoves. I wouldn't expect him to have many shoves here, but this seems pretty reasonable and kind of fits what I would expect his calling range to look like. So let's look at this flop. I used to think about these flops entirely wrong. The way that I used to think about these was I would view them in terms of purely, is this a dry flop or is this a wet flop? Now, thinking in those terms versus weaker recreational players is perfectly fine. In fact, that is actually still the way that I approach most weak recreational players, is I just think in terms of, did this board hit their defense range? And if it did, how large do I want to bet relative to my hand? It's a very simplified and easy way to play versus these recreational players. It is very exploitative way to play, and versus good players, you will get destroyed doing this. However, as I started studying GTO and really looking into it, I then started to learn that instead of thinking in terms of wet or dry, we instead should be thinking in terms of dynamic or static. So in terms of order of operations to think about a hand post-flop, you first think in terms of how deep effective are you, because that's going to be the most important factor in determining bet size for the most part. And then the second most important factor, or equally tied most important factor, is how dynamic is the board texture. What dynamic means is, does the best hand possible change on the turn or on the next street on a lot of different cards? So great example of a very dynamic board texture would be something like, say, 6-10 queen with a flush draw being possible. On this board texture, the best hand possible changes on 6s through aces as well as the flush card. So obviously not the entire card of the deck, but
yeah, I gotta be honest, I don't know what entire card of the deck means either, but it sounds really official, and we should definitely make that a real thing in poker from now on.
This board texture, not only is it super dynamic board, but it also often connects with both players' ranges. So from a strategic standpoint and from a absolute standpoint and from a relative standpoint, that board texture is going to be very dynamic. Now this board texture, king, queen, 10, monotone, this board texture is a very static board. Best hand possible is a royal flush. Best hand possible does not change on any card at any point for any reason.
Hey everybody, just a quick editorial note. I wanted to point out that the board on the bottom is the board that occurred in-game, and then the board in Rain's Trainer Toast is what we have a solution for. Obviously, from a strategic standpoint, it makes no never mind, but I did want to point out the difference just to avoid any confusion. But like I said, strategically, doesn't matter at all.
So, because of that, this board texture is very static. On top of that, we're only 30 big blinds deep effective. So, being 30 big blinds deep effective and a static board texture, that means the main bet size I'm going to use here is a quarter pot. So, let's look at what my range looks like from a theory standpoint. When I do bet, what do I bet? A quarter pot. Why? Static board, and we're not that deep effective. Theory. So obviously this is a somewhat simplification of how theory works, but from a theory perspective, I want to bet small here for those reasons. Now from an exploitative standpoint, I do not want to bet small, because still from an exploitative standpoint, I'm largely just going to be thinking about, does this player's range hit this board texture? And if I bet big, am I likely to get called? And what types of hands am I going to get called by? So here, I think I'm going to get called by straight draws, by flush draws, by top pairs, by 10x. So if my opponent is fairly weak, I'm going to go fairly large here. Pot size of 14K, I'm probably going to bet around 10K. It's 2/3 pot-ish. It's big clean size. I'm going to get called by a lot of different hands. We get to build the pot with a strong hand, and we get some protection. So going large here accomplishes a lot from an exploitative standpoint. From a theory standpoint, though, we just bet small. So he checks to me. I bet essentially a quarter pot. I bet 3K into 14K. And then he raises, and he raises small, which is what he's supposed to do from a theory perspective. So he raises to 8.5K. We're going to look at what his check raising range is supposed to look like. Looks like he has pretty much every Jack X except for Jack X of spades. He largely just traps those. Looking down in the bottom left here, you can see Jack 9 of spades, just check call. Jack 8 of spades, check call. Jack 7 of spades. All of this brown is him check raising, so these are pretty. He has a lot of like Jack X check raise bluffs, especially his bear Jack of spade type hands. He can check raise his two pairs, although I block Queen 10. Queen Jack, he gets to check raise with the Jack of spades. It's almost like a value check raise. Top two pair, of course. I guess the worst hand he is check raising for value is Queen 10. I guess he has a very small amount of low King X, but I don't think he's actually going to use these ever as check raises. I think realistically, he's probably going to hit these two pairs as raises for the most part. He's definitely going to hit a lot of this Jack X, and he's also going to hit a decent amount of these types of hands down here. Ace 9 with the spade, Ace 8 with the spade, especially with the Ace of spades. I think he's going to hit a lot of these too. So because he is a very aggressive and younger player, and I do expect him to have a lot of loose check raises, not only are we calling, but we're not too concerned about not having the best hand. There are definitely a lot of really bad turn cards for us. And if we look at my pocket queens here versus small check raise, I am just supposed to call, and I do so. When he check raised, I didn't pick up on anything. I always try to do my best to try to pick up on tells, especially live during hands. I really didn't notice anything. Turn is the offsuit 7. And now he barrels for half pot, which looks like he's splitting between small and medium. He barrels medium. And versus half pot bet, I obviously have a fairly easy call. My queen still by itself might be the best hand. If we look at his bets, I could certainly just have the best hand here because I beat all of his bluffs. And if he does happen to have me beat, I could certainly just river full house to have the best hand. So I believe I have a very easy call here, especially being in position 2. And actually it looks like, ooh, interesting. Whoa. Huh. Just value jams.
One eternity later.
See, the issue is I think he's actually going to bet a decent amount of these flushes. I think he could certainly have all of his nut flushes. All of his lower flushes, obviously, he's going to have these. I don't think he's going to have a lot of these other bluffs, but I do think he's going to have a lot of these low flushes. So I guess I think his turn barrel range is a bit different than GTO here in that I think he's going to be pushing for value all of his flushes for the most part. I don't really see him checking any of them. But in Theory World, he is checking a lot of his strongest flushes. And so when he does bet, then since he does have a decent number of flush draws, pocket queens, kings, they just want to value jam and jam for protection. But since I think he has a decent amount of extra flushes in there, I am going to call instead. But I did think that queens from a theory perspective was supposed to be a call here. I'm somewhat surprised that it is a raise. It makes sense as to why once I see it, but I had no idea about that. So we get to learn, which is always great. So I call. So I now have a hand outside of my theory range. River is an offsuit 5. And then he goes all in. I do have him covered here, but I do not have him covered by very much. And on this river, if I do have queens here, it is obviously a call. But even though it is a call, something I wanted to point out in this hand is look at these calls. Just because a hand in absolute terms is stronger than another hand doesn't mean it's going to be a much better bluff catch. Oftentimes, your best river bluff catches are those that either beat value, so if you beat value, you're almost always calling, or block their strongest hands. Blocking their strongest hands and unblocking their best bluffs is incredibly, incredibly, incredibly important, even more important than absolute hand strength. The only time absolute hand strength is really, 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 really matters is when you significantly beat their value hands. So if you have a hand that beats a decent number of value combos, you should definitely be calling. Queens here on the river doesn't actually beat any value hands. All I beat are bluffs. But what I do have here is I unblock so many of those bluff combos because a lot of them have the bear jack in it or have the bear ace of spades or bear nine of spades in it. So when I unblock all of those hands, in my mind, I have a fairly easy call, especially against a player that I believe is very, 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 very capable. Now, honestly, versus almost everyone else in this field, I would have folded. Just the fact that he is an incredibly aggressive player only makes this a call. I think in general, if you call on this spot, you're going to lose versus the vast majority of players. So keep that in mind when you are studying theory. That is honestly one of the most important things when studying theory is to remember most players just aren't capable of having any of the types of bluffs that they need to have. So when you are thinking about bluff catching, you must be very certain that this player is going to be capable of having the types of bluffs that you unblock and the type of value that you beat. Thank you for watching this episode. Stay safe and healthy out there, and best of luck at the tables.